They took a photo shaking hands when they kicked me out of the brainchild they never understood. They thought they could buy everything. I just stayed silent, because there was a line of text they never bothered to read. And that was what would devour them from the inside. My name is Hannah Reed. I'm 41 years old, though most days I feel both ancient and impossibly young, like I've lived through several lifetimes compressed into Silicon Valleys and server rooms. This is the story of how we built something beautiful, watched it get stolen, and then took it back in a way that still makes corporate lawyers wake up in cold sweats. It started, as these things often do, in a garage. Not the mythical Silicon Valley garage where legends are born, but a humid, spider-infested concrete box in Portland where the rain drummed endless percussion on the corrugated roof. 3 of us, me, Lena Vasquez, and Morgan Taylor. 3 burned-out tech workers who'd had enough of building other people's dreams. Lena was our product visionary, the one who could look at a mess of data and see patterns that made CFOs weep with joy. She had this way of tilting her head when she was thinking, dark hair falling across her shoulder, fingers dancing in the air as if she was conducting an invisible orchestra of possibilities. Morgan was our CTO, a quiet genius who spoke in code more fluently than English. He'd worked at 3 different startups that had imploded spectacularly, each time walking away with hard lessons etched into his methodical mind. And me, I was the one who could translate between them, who could take Morgan's architectural brilliance and Lena's product dreams and forge them into something real. I was also the one who'd learned, through painful experience, to read every single line of every single contract. SpireQuant was born on a Tuesday at 3 a.m. I remember because Morgan had been debugging for 17 hours straight, fueled by nothing but Red Bull and spite, when suddenly he sat back in his chair and said, "Holy shit, it works." What it was would eventually revolutionize how companies analyze their data streams. But that night, it was just 3 exhausted people staring at green text on black screens, watching patterns emerge from chaos like constellations forming in digital space. We built it methodically, obsessively. Every line of code was debated, tested, refined. Lena would sketch user flows on our whiteboard until it looked like the fevered dreams of a mathematician. Morgan would architect systems with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. I'd negotiate with potential clients, manage our burn rate down to the penny, and make sure we all occasionally remembered to eat actual food instead of just coffee and ambition. The early days blur together now. 18-hour coding sessions, pitches to VCs who looked at us like we were speaking ancient Sumerian, Lena sleeping under her desk because it was closer than going home, Morgan's girlfriend leaving him because he missed their anniversary to fix a critical bug, my own relationships crumbling like sandcastles at high tide. But we were building something extraordinary. SpireQuant wasn't just another analytics platform. It was predictive in ways that seemed almost prophetic, intuitive in ways that made users feel like it was reading their minds. Companies that used it saw their efficiency metrics spike by percentages that shouldn't have been possible. The tech press started noticing. TechCrunch called us the most innovative data startup you've never heard of. Forbes put Lena on their 30 under 30 list, though she was actually 31 and we all agreed not to correct them. Suddenly, the VCs who'd ignored us were sliding into our DMs like desperate exes. That's when Aventus Digital Holdings entered the picture. They came to us like wolves dressed as sheep, all sharp suits and practiced smiles. The acquisition team was led by a woman named Patricia Morse, who had the kind of handshake that left bruises and eyes that calculated your worth down to the cent. She brought a PowerPoint deck that was more art than business plan, full of synergies and scale and strategic partnerships that would take SpireQuant to the next level. "You've built something special," Patricia said, sitting in our conference room that still smelled faintly of the previous tenant's failed kombucha startup. "But to truly realize its potential, you need resources, infrastructure, global reach." She wasn't wrong. We were struggling to scale, turning down clients because we couldn't handle the load. Our servers were held together with digital duct tape and prayers. Morgan hadn't slept properly in months, living in constant fear of the 3 a.m. call that everything had crashed. The number they offered was stunning $290 million. I remember Lena's sharp intake of breath. Morgan's fingers stopped their constant laptop drumming. My own heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird. Patricia smiled, knowing she had us. Of course, We want you to stay on. You're the visionaries. We just want to give you the tools to build your vision at scale. The negotiations took 3 months. 3 months of lawyers and term sheets and due diligence that felt like a medical exam performed by accountants. They pored over our code, our contracts, our client lists. They interviewed our employees, our customers, our janitor. And through it all, I worked with our lawyer, Darlene Cho, on something special. Darlene was a small woman with a voice like velvet over steel. She'd been recommended by a friend who'd survived his own acquisition horror story. The key, she told me over whiskey at a bar that lawyers frequented when they needed to forget about billable hours, is to plan for betrayal. That's cynical, I said. That's experience, she countered. They'll promise you the world. They'll swear you're essential. Then they'll gut your company and discard you like yesterday's garbage. Unless. She smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd seen corporate massacres and learned to plant landmines. Unless you make it catastrophically expensive for them to do so. That's how Clause 3.7b was born, buried deep in Appendix 2 of the acquisition agreement, written in the kind of legalese that makes normal humans' eyes glaze over. It was beautiful in its simplicity. If any of the 3 original founders were terminated without cause within 24 months of the acquisition, all intellectual property rights would automatically revert to a new entity controlled by said founders. They'll never agree to this, I said when I first read it. They will, Darlene assured me, because they won't read it, these corporate acquisitions. They have teams of lawyers, but they're all focused on the big stuff: purchase price, earn-out provisions, non-compete clauses, the appendices. Those are for junior associates who are more concerned with impressing partners than actually reading every line. She was right. Aventus's legal team, led by a slick Harvard Law grad named Preston Whitmore, focused entirely on negotiating our earn-out targets and retention bonuses. They haggled over percentage points and vesting schedules, while Clause 3.7b sat quietly in the appendices like a sleeping dragon. The signing day was everything you'd expect from corporate theater. Champagne that cost more than most people's rent. A photographer capturing candid moments of partnership and synergy. Preston gave a speech about combining Aventus's global reach with SpireQuant's innovative spirit. Patricia presented us with Aventus-branded Mont Blanc pens to sign with, as if we were heads of state ratifying a treaty. I signed with my own pen, a cheap Bic I'd bought at a gas station. Nobody noticed the small rebellion. The photo they released to the press showed all of us shaking hands, smiling. Lena looked radiant, her success finally validated by a number with so many zeros. Morgan looked uncomfortable in his new suit, already itching to get back to his code. And me, I looked like someone who'd just sold her soul and was trying to calculate the exchange rate. To the future, Patricia toasted, raising her champagne flute. To the future, we echoed. I wondered if she knew she was toasting her own destruction. The integration started immediately. On our first day as part of the Aventus family, we were greeted by what they called the Transition Excellence Team. 3 consultants from New York Preston, who'd apparently shifted from legal to operations, Elliot Burke and Sawyer James. They swept into our offices like an occupying force, all pressed shirts and practiced enthusiasm. We're here to help optimize your processes, Elliot explained, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. He was the kind of person who said synergy unironically and had strong opinions about font choices and presentations. Our processes work fine, Morgan said flatly. Of course they do, Sawyer chimed in with the kind of aggressive positivity that made you want to check your wallet. We're just here to make them even better, to scale them, to enterprise-ify them. Enterprise-ify isn't a word, Lena pointed out. Preston laughed like she'd made a delightful joke. That's the kind of innovative thinking we love. But let's channel it into our new frameworks. The frameworks arrived in boxes, literal boxes full of binders, each one detailing a different aspect of the Aventus way. There were procedures for procedures, protocols for protocols. Our simple stand-up meetings became daily alignment sessions with required documentation. Our whiteboard brainstorming became innovation workshops that needed approval forms filed 48 hours in advance. This is insane, Morgan said after a particularly painful meeting about implementing a 17-step process for deploying code that we used to push with a single command. It's temporary, I assured him, though the words tasted like ash. Once they see how we work, they'll adapt. But they didn't adapt, they replaced. First, it was little things. Our favorite coffee machine disappeared, replaced by an Aventis-branded monster that required a badge scan and produced coffee that tasted like disappointment. Our flexible work hours became core collaboration hours from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Our dog-friendly office policy ended because Sawyer was allergic, though I once saw him petting a golden retriever at a food truck. Then came the personnel changes. "We're bringing in some additional resources," Patricia announced during one of her monthly visits, "to support your growth." The resources were a parade of MBAs fresh from programs where they'd learned to disrupt markets they didn't understand. They had names like Bradley and Madison and spoke entirely in acronyms. They scheduled meetings about meetings. They created PowerPoints about PowerPoints. They transformed our lean, efficient operation into a bloated corporate machine that moved with all the grace of a three-legged elephant. Lena was the first to be sidelined. Her role as Chief Product Officer was suddenly evolved into Head of User Emotion Experience, a title that meant nothing and came with responsibilities that meant even less. "What the hell is user emotion experience?" she asked Preston after the announcement. "It's about connecting with users on a deeper level," he explained with a straight face. "Understanding not just what they need, but what they feel." "That's what good product design does automatically," Lena protested. "Exactly. Which is why you're perfect for this evolution of the role." She was moved to a corner office that looked impressive, but was miles from where actual decisions were made. Her product roadmaps were replaced by feeling journeys. Her data-driven insights were dismissed in favor of intuitive emotional mapping, created by consultants who'd never actually used our product. Morgan fared slightly better, but only because they couldn't quite figure out how to replace him yet. But they tried to cage him. Every piece of code now needed to go through a review board. Every architectural decision required a 60-page justification document. His elegant solutions were butchered by committees who insisted on best practices they'd read about in management books, written by people who'd never written a line of code. "I spent 4 hours in a meeting today," he told me one evening, both of us staying late, not because we were building something, but because we were filling out compliance forms. 4 hours discussing whether we should use tabs or spaces in our code formatting. They took a vote. A vote. Hannah, democracy has no place in syntax. And me, I became the founder brand ambassador, a role that essentially meant I was a very expensive mascot. I gave talks at conferences about innovation while watching our actual innovation being strangled by process. I smiled for photo ops, while our original vision was focus grouped into oblivion. The real knife twist came when they started pushing out our original team. The engineers who'd built SpireQuant from scratch were replaced by resources from Aventis's preferred staffing agencies. People who knew our codebase like their own children were swapped for contractors who needed documentation for documentation. Jin, our lead back-end engineer who'd been with us since year 2, was told his position was being restructured. "They said I don't have enough enterprise experience," he told me, laughing bitterly. "I built the entire authentication system that they're now trying to understand. But sure, I lack enterprise experience." Sarah, our data scientist who'd created the algorithms that made SpireQuant actually work, was informed her methods were too unconventional for Aventis standards. "Unconventional," she said during her exit interview, which I wasn't supposed to be in but crashed anyway. "My unconventional methods are why Fortune 500 companies pay millions for our insights. But hey, I'm sure someone with a Six Sigma certification will do better." One by one, they left, and with each departure, a little more of SpireQuant's soul walked out the door. But I stayed. We all stayed. Lena in her meaningless corner office, creating emotional journey maps that no one read. Morgan in his increasingly constrained architect role, watching contractors butcher his elegant code. Me in my ambassador position, lying through my teeth about how excited we were about the synergies. We stayed because we were waiting and documenting. Every disastrous decision, I logged. Every time they ignored our advice and broke something, I kept records. When Preston pushed a production update without testing and brought down 3 major client systems, I saved every email, every Slack message, every panicked call transcript. When Elliot insisted on optimizing our database structure and accidentally deleted 2 years of historical data thankfully backed up, no thanks to him, I documented every step of his incompetence. When Sawyer's innovative new user interface caused our user engagement to plummet by 47%, I kept every metric, every complaint, every rage quit recorded. My personal laptop became a museum of corporate malpractice. Each folder meticulously organized, each piece of evidence carefully preserved. "Why are you doing this?" Morgan asked once, catching me screenshotting yet another disaster. "Insurance," I said simply. He nodded, understanding. We'd all become cynical by then, watching our creation be transformed into something we didn't recognize. SpireQuant still functioned, but like a sports car being driven by someone who'd never shifted out of first gear. All that power, all that potential, wasted by people who thought they knew better because they had fancier degrees and used bigger words. The breaking point came 17 months after the acquisition. I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there: the sudden increase in check-in meetings with Lena, the way Preston had started documenting her performance issues, which mainly consisted of her pointing out their terrible decisions, the hushed conversations that stopped when she walked by. But I'd hoped, stupidly, naively hoped, that they'd realize they needed at least one of us who actually understood what we'd built. The email came on a Wednesday. I remember because Wednesdays were when we used to have our product planning sessions, back when we actually planned products instead of just watching consultants destroy them. Effective immediately, Lena Vasquez's position has been eliminated as part of our ongoing optimization efforts. The company-wide email read, "We thank her for her contributions and wish her the best in her future endeavors." Corporate speak for, "We fired one of the 3 people who actually knows how this company works." I found Lena in her office, packing her things into a cardboard box while a security guard stood awkwardly by the door. Company policy, apparently, as if she was going to steal the staplers she'd bought with her own money when we couldn't afford office supplies. "Don't," she said when she saw my face. "Not here, not now." But her eyes said everything. 17 months of frustration, of watching our work be destroyed, of being sidelined and ignored and finally discarded like obsolete equipment. I helped her pack in silence. Her awards, the photo from our first client signing, the lucky rubber duck she kept on her desk for debugging sessions, each item a small monument to what we'd built and what they'd destroyed. As she walked out, head high despite everything, I knew 2 things with absolute certainty. 1, they'd come for Morgan and me next. We were expensive remnants of the old regime, keeping them from fully transforming SpireQuant into another soulless Aventus subsidiary. 2, they'd just activated Clause 3.7b. The beauty of good contract language is its precision. Darlene had crafted Clause 3.7b like a Swiss watch, every word chosen for maximum impact. "Terminated without cause" was the key phrase, and Lena's termination email, in all its corporate speak glory, had admitted exactly that her position was eliminated for optimization, not for any failure on her part. I called Darlene that night from my car, paranoid enough by then to avoid any phone that Aventis might monitor. "It's time," I said. "You're sure once we trigger this, there's no going back?" "They fired Lena, without cause. It's all documented." I could hear her smile through the phone. "Then let's begin." The next few months required Oscar-worthy performance on my part. I showed up every day, smiled in meetings, nodded along as Preston explained their latest innovation, usually something we'd suggested months ago and been ignored. I watched them systematically dismantle everything we'd built, replacing elegant solutions with bloated enterprise monstrosities. Morgan lasted another 3 months. They were more careful with him, trying to build a case for termination with cause, but Morgan, bless his methodical heart, had been documenting everything too. Every impossible deadline, every contradictory requirement, every time they blamed him for failures caused by their own interference. When they finally pulled the trigger, citing failure to adapt to enterprise methodologies, we were ready. Morgan's lawyer, recommended by Darlene, naturally had already prepared a wrongful termination suit that would have kept them tied up in court for years. But that wasn't the point. The point was that they'd now terminated 2 of the 3 original founders without cause. My turn came 2 weeks later. By then, I think they suspected something was wrong. The lawyers had started sniffing around the termination agreements, but they were looking in the wrong place. They were so focused on non-competes and IP assignments that they never thought to check the original acquisition documents. The meeting was almost anticlimactic. Preston, Patricia, and someone from HR I'd never seen before, all sitting across from me in the conference room, where we'd once planned world domination over pizza and energy drinks. "Hannah," Patricia began, her voice dripping with fake sympathy, "I'm afraid we need to discuss your future with Aventis." "Let me save you the speech," I said, pulling out my phone to record. "You're eliminating my position as part of ongoing optimization efforts. You thank me for my contributions and wish me the best in my future endeavors." Preston frowned. "How did you—" "It's the same email you sent about Lena. And Morgan, you didn't even bother to change the template." They exchanged glances, suddenly uncertain. But corporate inertia is a powerful force. They'd started this process, and they were going to finish it, even as unease crept into their expressions. "We're prepared to offer a generous severance package," the HR person said, sliding a folder across the table. I didn't even open it. "I'll have my lawyer review it. Of course, we'll need you to return all company property, transfer all passwords, and—" "I know the drill." I stood up, suddenly feeling lighter than I had in 2 years. "Oh, one more thing. You might want to have your legal team review the original acquisition agreement, specifically Appendix 2, Clause 3.7b. The way the color drained from Preston's face was almost worth the past 2 years of hell. I walked out of that building for the last time with my head high and my phone already buzzing with texts from Darlene. The clock was ticking, and we had work to do. Here's the thing about intellectual property in tech: it's not just the code, it's the architecture, the algorithms, the specific implementations that make generic concepts actually work. And according to Clause 3.7b, all of that now belonged to a new entity that Darlene had quietly set up months ago, Phoenix Digital Solutions, LLC. Aventis still had the code, of course. They had it sitting on their servers, running their operations, serving their clients, but they no longer had the right to use it. The first sign of trouble came 72 hours later. The authentication tokens that validated Aventis's right to run SpireQuant's core algorithms expired. We'd built in a phone home system years ago, a simple security measure to prevent unauthorized use. Every 3 days, the system would check in with a validation server to confirm it was being run by authorized users. That server now belonged to Phoenix Digital Solutions, and Phoenix Digital Solutions had not authorized Aventis to use its intellectual property. I was having coffee with Lena when her phone started buzzing, then mine, then Morgan's, all our former colleagues, the few who'd survived the purges, texting variations of "WTF is happening." The system was failing gracefully, as Morgan had designed it to. It wasn't crashing or deleting data, it was simply stopping, refusing to process new requests, displaying a polite message: "License validation failed. Please contact your system administrator." The beauty was that Aventis's own actions had made it worse. They'd pushed out everyone who understood the system deeply. The contractors and enterprise experts they'd brought in knew how to run the system, but not how to fix it when something fundamental went wrong. They were like pilots who'd learned to fly on autopilot suddenly faced with manual controls. The panic started immediately. Client systems depending on SpireQuant's insights started failing. Real-time analytics stopped updating. Predictive models froze. Fortune 500 companies that paid millions for these services started calling, and Aventis had no answers. I know because we were watching, not hacking, nothing illegal, just monitoring public forums, social media, the places where tech workers go to scream into the void when everything's on fire and management is clueless. "Anyone know how to bypass license validation in SpireQuant?" appeared on Stack Overflow. "Urgent SpireQuant API returning 403 errors, need fix ASAP," popped up on Reddit. "If anyone from the original SpireQuant team is reading this, please DM me. We'll pay consultant rates," showed up on Hacker News. But the best intel came from an unexpected source. Remember Jin, our lead back-end engineer who'd been pushed out for lacking enterprise experience? He'd landed at one of Aventis's competitors and still had friends on the inside. Friends who were more than happy to share the ongoing meltdown. The internal Slack messages he forwarded were pure gold. Preston emergency, all hands. Conference room A, now. Elliot. Who has the master passwords? Morgan's credentials aren't working. Sawyer Legal says we can't discuss details but fix this now. Random contractor. Can someone explain what a validation server is? Another contractor. Why is the documentation password protected? Preston stopped discussing on Slack, in person only. They tried everything. Aventus's legal team sent cease and desist letters, which Darlene cheerfully responded to with copies of Clause 3.7b, highlighted in yellow. They tried to hack around the validation, but Morgan had built it too well. They tried to rebuild the system from scratch, but without understanding the underlying algorithms, they were essentially trying to recreate a symphony by humming the tune. Meanwhile, we weren't sitting idle. Lena had already started reaching out to our former clients, not to poach that would violate non-competes, but to catch up. Amazing how many of them mentioned their frustrations with the new SpireQuant, how it had become bloated, slow, unresponsive to their needs. If only someone would build something like the old SpireQuant, they'd say with heavy hints. Interesting idea, Lena would respond. I'll keep that in mind. Morgan was rebuilding. Not SpireQuant, we couldn't use that name, or any of the trademarked elements, but the core algorithms, the architectural principles, the elegant solutions that made it work. Those were ours again, and this time, we were building it right. No technical debt, no compromises, no consultants suggesting enterprise-grade solutions that were just expensive ways to make simple things complicated. And me, I was orchestrating the narrative. Not through press releases or public statements, we stayed completely silent, which drove Aventus crazy, but through carefully placed observations in the right forums, thoughtful comments on industry blogs, subtle reminders that the original SpireQuant team was still out there, still innovating, still building. The story broke and wired 2 weeks after the systems failed. The $290 million clause, how a single line of text brought down a tech giant's acquisition. Some enterprising journalist had gotten hold of the court filings, connected the dots, and realized what had happened. The article was brutal in its simplicity. It laid out how Aventus had acquired SpireQuant, pushed out the founders, and in doing so, triggered a clause that reverted all intellectual property rights. It included screenshots of the panicked Stack Overflow posts, quotes from frustrated clients, and a particularly damning statistic: Aventus's stock had dropped 18% since SpireQuant stopped working. But the kill shot was the interview with a senior Aventus executive who admitted they hadn't thoroughly reviewed all appendices of the acquisition agreement. It's standard practice to focus on the main terms, the executive said. The appendices are usually just technical details. The interviewer's follow-up was perfect. So you spent $290 million without reading the whole contract. The executive's response was telling, no comment. Social media exploded. #read the contract started trending. Business schools started using it as a case study in due diligence failures. Legal blogs had a field day analyzing how such a simple clause had been missed. But my favorite response came from a Reddit comment that went viral. Imagine firing the people who built your $290 million product and not realizing they'd planned for exactly that. That's not just stupid, it's advanced stupid. Aventus tried damage control. Patricia went on CNBC to explain their position, but the interviewer's first question set the tone. Did you read the entire contract before spending $290 million? Her practiced corporate speak couldn't hide the fundamental truth they'd been outmaneuvered by the very people they'd tried to discard. Preston wrote a LinkedIn post about learning from challenges and the importance of thorough review processes that was so heavily ratioed the comment section became a masterclass in corporate schadenfreude. Sawyer quietly updated his resume and disappeared from the company directory. Elliot tried to blame the whole thing on unclear documentation practices by the previous team, which prompted Morgan to publicly release our entire documentation repository clear, comprehensive, and password-protected with credentials that Aventus would have had if they'd kept any of the people who actually knew how the system worked. Through it all, we said nothing.